College football nerds here this week, talking a little bit closer to college football season action, and it's obviously we're going to do a little bit of preview stuff for y'all. We got Texas A&M and Florida State, maybe one more if we got time, but we probably won't. And we're also going to talk about Jim Harbaugh's maybe hot water situation that he's gotten himself into. But first, Josh, I want to talk about it's not so much news coming out of this whole conference realignment with the Big Ten, as much as commissioners and athletic departments talking about how we're going to have to move to 10 games because we got so many teams. And Josh, it makes a lot of sense to me that they would go to a 10-game schedule because you've brought all these teams in. You want them to play one another, but also it's really the only way to capitalize on the financial potential of having a super conference like that, because that's how you have, in-conference games playing each other. That's how you get more TV revenue. That's how you get more gate receipts and things like that. So it makes sense to me. I totally get it. But Josh, I'm worried for the very thing that we have talked about for years. Maybe this is something that had to happen, but the result of this that nobody's talking about is, okay, you've gone from a 9-game schedule and in some conferences an 8-game conference schedule to a 10. So now you only have 2 games that aren't in conference, and you're either going to drop your big-time Power 5 out of conference game or you're going to drop one of your paycheck games. Josh, I think both of these scenarios, and both are going to happen, I think they're both bad for football.
It's hard to see a reality where college football is going to be as egalitarian as it used to be. And that's kind of a funny thing to say because college football has always been criticized as a sport that was about supporting the elites at the detriment of the lesser schools and conferences. But I think, as we've often said on this show, people don't understand that just because something has a problem doesn't mean it can't be worse. The reality for college football going forward is that these bigger conferences, now that they have more teams, are going to be more interested in investing in those teams playing each other. The expanded playoff now means that if you end up second in your conference, by absolutely no means is it a bar for making the playoff. So now trying to expand the conference and knowing that the odds of being a champion of that conference go down isn't a big deal. And the natural reality of it is that you're going to squeeze out the other teams. Now, to your point, I think the problem is when you squeeze out the lesser teams, and I say lesser teams, smaller programs, what have you, it's going to have 2 effects. One is it's going to mean that those teams don't make the money that they used to because paychecks are a big deal. And 2, I think from a data point perspective, it's going to even further isolation because our complaint for a long time has been that those teams can go undefeated in their own schedules and it really doesn't mean anything relative to the larger conferences. Well, with the SEC and the Big Ten absorbing the better teams from the the Pac-12 and the Big Ten, or Big 12, wow, too many 10s and 12s now, and all of them have 16 teams. It's a little confusing. I think the reality is that, there's just going to be absolutely no stinking way to evaluate a Mountain West Conference team that goes undefeated in their schedule against a Big Ten or an SEC team that may well be 9-3, but probably could beat that undefeated Mountain West team into the dirt.
Yeah, and one of the things you've noted about the AAC in particular is they lost teams at the Big 12, and now they're not as good because whoever they backfill with are going to be teams from lesser conferences compared to the AAC. So there's also this problem of evaluating within a conference because how do we know what 10-2 or 11-1 looks like in the Big Ten relative to the SEC? I'm imagining the SEC is going to have to grab a couple of teams at some point. Maybe the ACC collapses or whatever. But one of the things that we've pushed for that was a dream that was never going to happen was all conferences play 8 conference games, but are mandated 2 Power 5 out of conference games. And that to me is 1, the most exciting for the fan. And 2, it gives us, the people who talk about the sport and the committee that picks, for who goes to the playoffs and things and rankings, it gives a great perspective on relative performance. What it feels like we're heading towards is a couple or 3 super conferences that spend the entire year in their own corners and then come together for the playoffs. I think in some way it makes that 12-team playoff a necessity because there is so much question on how these teams compare to one another. But it kind of makes me sad as a college football fan that this has become hyper regionalized. And yes, some of these teams are on the West Coast. They're out of the Big Ten quote unquote footprint, but they're in that conference. So they're all playing the same teams. Is that true in your mind? Like we have to have a 12-team or expanded playoff because of this now?
Well, I think there's a cause and effect problem here. I'm not sure if the 12-team playoff really pushed the reality that we're in now, or if the reality we're in now pushed for the 12-team playoff. I can't really say, but I do think with the system we have now, it's geared towards it, right? Because you're going to have, 18 teams in the Big Ten. At some point, schedules within the Big Ten are going to get really uneven. And I think that's something people haven't really given a lot of thought to. When you're only playing half your conference, and I know people don't play that many out of your division, but you were playing almost 2/3 of your conference or 3/4 of your conference. Now it's going to be about half. That doesn't really evaluate anything. And it can be entirely possible that one team's schedule is going to be way easier than another, especially now that they're doing away with divisions. So schedules are going to be, as a result of that, way more variable. Some are going to be way harder than others within the same conference. You have to have a 12-team playoff to make any sense of that and for it to be in any way fair. We've always said schedules are way too uneven in college football to be ranking teams purely off wins and losses. Now it gets even worse. And like you said, I think further expansion is coming. Breaking news today as we're recording this is that supposedly the ACC failed to vote in Cal and Stanford. Apparently, I think Florida State, NC State, North Carolina, and I want to say Clemson voted against it, and they needed one more vote, and they couldn't get it. And the reason for that being that those four teams already feel like they get inadequate shares of the revenue from the ACC because the other schools aren't pulling their weight. They don't want two more schools that are going to pull even lower revenue. So I think the reality is those teams may well get poached up. At some point, if this issue gets forced further, they're going to move over. And if you end up in a situation where the SEC is 20 teams and the Big Ten is 20 teams, that's 40 out of 130 teams in college football. And as we often say, from a playoff perspective, really only about 60, 65 teams are ever relevant. Well, if 2/3 of those teams are in just two conferences, the playoff is just going to be an invitational where you put 3 or 4 schools from each team and then a sprinkling of others. And yeah, I mean, that's what has to happen. You've got to have a 12-team playoff. It's the only way you'll have enough teams play at the end to make any sort of comparison. And it'll be fun for a couple of years because people are just going to assume, oh, well, we're going to get in there and the Big Ten's going to show the SEC how great we are. And vice versa. The SEC fans will be chanting their way into the playoff as normal. But what we're going to eventually find is the SEC is probably going to be consistently a little ahead of the Big Ten, as they have been for a while. And then the Big Ten and the SEC are going to be way ahead of everybody else, given how much they've absorbed and depleted the other conferences. So at some point, this first round of the playoffs is going to be kind of a foregone conclusion that has to happen because it's the only way to fairly evaluate really just the two conferences from teams in those two conferences.
Our watchers are used to us being grim reapers, especially you, Josh, but I'm going to put a slightly positive spin on this, something that I'm pretty excited for. One, I actually am excited for the 12-team playoff in the short term, just in general, but I do think that this super conference concept has one potential silver lining, and I want to get your opinion on it. I think it's going to force a complete change in how we evaluate teams going forward because of the unevenness, because of the schedules being completely disconnected. It's going to force us to look at teams and see how they actually performed in the games and not just look at the win-loss record. I think win-loss record ranking is not long for this world, and I think that's a very, very good thing. It's going to force people to actually watch the games and take away something more than just who won the game.
I think you're probably right. There's going to be a reality coming where you're going to have a year where Minnesota doesn't play any of Ohio State, Penn State, and Michigan. And Ohio State goes 11-1, losing to Penn State and beating Michigan, and they win the tiebreakers on those two. But Minnesota goes 10-0 within the conference, maybe even drops an out-of-conference game. Who knows? And they're going to win the Big Ten because they had the best record, especially if they drop conference championship games. Now, that conference title doesn't mean a whole heck of a lot if you drop conference championship games, but I still think it's really screwed up. And if you want to do the automatic qualifier thing, which we have now, right, where the top 4 slots, the bye slots, are the top 4 ranked conference champions, then at some point there's going to be an outcry because this is going to happen in the SEC or the Big Ten. It's going to be really clear that the team that won the conference was not the best team in the conference. They just avoided, and again, without divisions, it's going to be that much easier to avoid all the best teams in one year. And then another team that maybe drops one game but beats everybody else of any quality is going to be the non-champion. And for so many years we've been fighting this thing from people in different conferences. It's mostly been non-SEC fans because the SEC's been viewed as the best conference, so they haven't had as much to defend or be defensive about. But everybody wants to come up with reasons why one schedule is better than another, right? Well, we have a 9-game conference schedule, so it makes it harder. Well, we need to look at, wins and losses are all that matters because at the end of the day, all that matters is if you win. Well, that's really great if everything else was equal, but it's not, and it's not remotely equal. Schedule difficulty isn't remotely equal. Quality of opponents is not remotely equal. And you have to take that into account. You have to take quality of play and dominance into account at some level. And I've often said that if you're it's most apparent when you have teams of relatively similar, maybe 1 to 2 losses versus 0 to 1 loss or something. But yeah, I think when this argument becomes within the same conference, when it's Big Ten fans arguing with other Big Ten fans, Big 12 fans arguing with other Big 12 fans, that's going to change the way the narrative is perceived because so many people are hostile to the points and counterpoints we make because it's seen in this sort of inter-conference tribalism. I think they're going to be a lot more receptive to the realities of it when it's their own team and the team that's benefiting is somebody else within their own conference. So I do think it's going to cause some shifts in the way that fans view the teams, and then usually when you reach critical mass of fan viewpoints, it starts bleeding into the media.
It makes me sad, though, because I know how much these programs, like maybe not the top G5s, but these, Toledo and Akron, these teams, their lifeblood is getting 2 paycheck games a year, right? And not to even speak of the FCS. I know people hate FCS games, but it keeps a lot of those programs going. That's probably going away entirely. But not only that, these other like middle tier and lower tier G5s, they're going to go away too, because in this push to make everything about money, the have-nots are getting trampled left and right at every turn, not just in the rules, in the things we're doing with realignment, but all the rules we're doing that's making things easier to make, drop off bags of cash and recruit with it. It's just tough. But, I'm ready to move on and talk a little bit about Jim Harbaugh. You got anything else on this topic?
The only thing I'll say is people need to realize that, ironically, it's good for our channel for this to happen, right? I mean, we only generally cover bigger games and teams that are being more successful in a given year, partly just due to the amount of time we have. And we try to have a good focus and a lot of detail with what we're doing, especially during the season, and we can only cover so many teams in that level of detail. Mass media is undoubtedly the same way. These pundits on TV don't really want to cover all the smaller games. So when we make these statements and complain about things the way we do, we're defending something that has no benefit to us. We're defending it because we enjoy the sport as it is. We enjoy the presence of those teams in college football. And as much as we're seen as haters towards the G5, frankly, because we're honest in saying that those teams don't really have a place in a 14 playoff more often than not. Cincinnati had a great place in the playoff, and they should deserve to be there. We do want those teams part of the sport. And weirdly, us being the big team proponents, small team haters are the only ones that seem like sometimes are really defending the nature of the sport and how much it could sort of collapse. But the reality is that people like us that make content are going to benefit from the narrower focus of the sport. And even if fewer people watch, which I think is ESPN's going to concern that they're going to realize in a few years, still for us covering previews of the biggest games, we're going to do better because we're going to be able to have fewer selection of games, but between bigger teams and bigger fan bases. And so there's a really perverse incentive between the people that are giving you messaging on these issues and the realities of what the problems are going to be created.
And it's the same thing with the 12-team playoff. This channel and Josh Pate get frequent just hate on Twitter and on YouTube about our stances of not wanting to expand the playoffs. People don't realize, especially yes, for us, but we're not nearly as big as him. People don't realize how much Josh benefits with a 12-team playoff. His numbers are going to go absolutely bonkers. Our numbers are going to really improve next year in terms of, just engagement and having things to talk about that's going to drive the algorithm. But for the two kind of bigger voices in this space that are against it, we would benefit the most, us and Pate. And we're saying, no, this is not good because we actually love the sport. It's not just something we're doing for a paycheck. And so I appreciate the position of people that will do it to maybe their own detriment because they want to preserve the sport. And to that end, to your point, it's because we care about the have-nots, even though we mostly talk about the haves. The have-nots make the game great. All right, Josh, let's move on to Jim Harbaugh. It came out today. Breaking news. We never get breaking news. We only talk once a week, Josh. But it came out today that, I just saw the headline. You're the one that brought it up to me. I saw the headline that Jim Harbaugh's kind of 4-game suspension had been lifted. And I was like, oh, well, maybe they decided it wasn't that big a deal, or this is good news because now he's not even going to have to miss the first 4 games, even though they were against nobody. Josh, you have a different take because you actually read up on it and got more details than I did. So I'm going to hand it off to you and let you talk about how it might have some maybe darker implications.
So the realities of settlement negotiations, which I have been a part of in the real legal world a few times, is that not only do you have to have a settlement, but then you have to get the settlement approved by a judge. And any time that you're dealing with third parties that are involved with things, usually the approval process can be a little stickier. So what happened with the settlement for Harbaugh is that the settlement that was approved, as I understand it, by the enforcement staff, and there's sort of a full-time staff that does infractions enforcement in the NCAA, and then there's the Committee of Infractions, and the Committee of Infractions are made up of representatives from member institutions. Now, a constant complaint of mine is the NCAA does not stack the Committee on Infractions with only people of the same level as the schools are evaluating. So a lot of times there's small school ADs that have a very different set of priorities and understandings of the sport that make up a lot of those committees. So that's a separate issue. That's why they're so out there in their rulings and inconsistent. They need to split the bodies up and only have P5 ADs ruling on P5 teams. Slight aside there. But that current Committee of Infractions has denied the settlement agreement that was reached between the enforcement staff and Harbaugh, as I understand it. It may not be the enforcement staff, but it's essentially a similar body that was a full-time employee body of the NCAA that was negotiating in this issue. And what that really means when they deny the settlement, it really only means that they think the settlement wasn't harsh enough. And so that it's a very strong signal that when this case goes before the NCAA Committee on Infractions, they are going to want to rule more harshly than has currently been ruled, or they feel like there are facts that they need more information on to be able to approve it. I don't know that I've ever really heard of a settlement being denied because it was unduly harsh. That would be very unexpected. It's almost always because it isn't harsh enough. And so really there are a couple things there. One, a lot of times I've heard people talk about, oh, it was just over a cheeseburger. They made clear today, and it's my understanding from stuff I've read and stuff I've heard, that it's not really about, giving a kid a cheeseburger. And I know years ago, right, there's so many cases of this. Everybody says it's about something minor, right? The Alabama a long time ago, they said, oh, it was about selling a kid a hot dog in a press box. Well, the reality is that there's a lot of things that go into these infraction cases, and there's often some minor issue that's a part of it. But the reality for Harbaugh is that there were allegations of, one, doing improper visits during dead periods, and that was particularly during COVID. And the NCAA has been really harsh on that. LSU got a punishment recently that was a little rough, and people thought it was a slap on the wrist. What people didn't understand is LSU's punishment was solely due to the fact that under the Orgeron, they were conducting visits during the COVID dead period, and they hit them with a bunch of sanctions for that. Because, as you guess, with COVID and the nature of it, it's like, hey, we're doing this for everybody's safety. We all agreed to do it for people's safety. You dare not cheat the system when the system was created for the safety of the players and the school. That's something that they're not going to let you touch, partly probably for liability reasons. But when you start crossing lines that exist for safety's sake, they are going to hit you hard. LSU was punished solely for that issue. Every other remaining issue is actually still ongoing. I imagine probably within the next 18 months you'll get a ruling on that. And so a lot of the Will Wade stuff and other stuff is actually still hanging out there. But Harbaugh is kind of in a similar boat. They were doing things during the COVID dead periods. The NCAA has been extremely harsh on that. There were also some allegations of having too many assistants and player coaches on the field during training and evaluation periods. That's a gray area the NCAA is constantly having to fight, right? Because they put all the coaches sitting up over in the practice fields, and in voluntary practices, they're all sitting at the window watching the players practice. They're not there coaching them, but they're watching. And now everybody has these huge additional sets of staffers and managers on the program. And, it's kind of infamous at this point how many head coaches from the college or the NFL are staffers for Alabama. Well, those guys aren't allowed to be coaches, so they can't be on the field during practice. And Harbaugh bent a lot of the rules around a lot of those things, and that's what this is really about. Yeah, there is an issue of selling a cheeseburger to a kid or giving him one without paying for it, but that's relatively minor. It's more about the operational aspects. The Committee of Infractions has denied the settlement, which means they're probably going to be unduly harsh, and then that leads to the other point, which is if they're going to be unduly harsh to him, and Harbaugh's been flirting with the NFL, which has been known for a few years, what's the likelihood that Harbaugh's going to want to stick around to find out what punishment he's going to get? Because that punishment's probably going to come in during the offseason in 2024. Or is he just going to want to try to have a great year, capitalize it, and get the heck out of Dodge before the punishment hits? And I'll note that's the exact same thing that happened with Pete Carroll and then Chip Kelly. Nobody knows. Chip Kelly was given a show cause and was banned from coaching when he went to the NFL. It's out there. It's public information. But he left, and it only came out after he left, and nobody really wanted to talk or report about it. But Chip Kelly was caught red-handed paying for C-Strunk, a running back, out of Texas. They paid, I think, it was a 5-figure sum to a recruiting service, which ended up just proving out to be his handler with some made-up paperwork and information that was passed on to C-Strunk to sign him. Yeah, so this happens a lot, and usually when these issues start coming up and it's bad enough, if the coach is good enough, you bolt to the NFL where there's absolutely zero repercussion for your actions, and you can just skip town before any of the punishments hit you.
Yeah, and I will also note that it was really a lot of this is speculation, but there is heavy speculation that Harbaugh or in combination with his staff misled the NCAA, and they deemed that a lot more serious than even the violations themselves, which is, that's something similar to like Ohio State and gold pants and tattoos. And it's almost always not just or very little bit about the infraction. It's about lying to the NCAA. I think Alabama had a defensive line coach that was beloved down there that lied to the NCAA and got a show cause. So I think that's something that people need to remember is it's a whole thing. And to your point, Michigan fans will probably see this speculation that we're making about him going to the NFL as some like we're hating on Michigan or whatever, but it's not a big leap. It's not a huge leap to sort of trade on the information that we know. And that information we know is he's looked at an NFL, I think, a couple of years in a row. And it's not been quiet about it. Now, that doesn't mean he won't stay at Michigan forever, but it does mean that if there are things that can make your job and therefore your legacy or your ability to get better jobs or, get more money in your own job or whatever, external factors that come in that are outside of your control at this point come in, then yeah, you're going to bolt to the NFL if there's an opportunity. And that means, he very well might take a good year and try to move that to the NFL. A lot of it is speculative at this point, but I think it's a very good point to tie together, that this has happened in the past. It's not, something that's really unfounded. The question is, Josh, based on what we know, is it a guess on when these infractions, or they finally settle, are going to come down? Is it a situation where They gave them the 4 games, likely to try to get it in ahead of the season because they wouldn't have some other resolution. They're not going to hit him mid-season with some sort of infraction or punishment.
Yeah, I'm sure the settlement was to get the issue resolved. This sort of stuff can be a really bad issue in recruiting because other coaches are going to talk about, oh, he's got this cloud hanging over him and he may leave. And if you're a kid that's got to sign the beginning of December, that's going to be in the back of your mind once you hear those things and you confirm that it's actually a reality. No matter what Harbaugh says, it's going to be a little niggling doubt that eats against you in a very, very tough world in recruiting. Look, the cynical part of me also says they reached a settlement of 4 games, and you look at that schedule for Michigan, and this is a team that's not playing a P5 out of conference. And what was it? Rutgers, Indiana? Who do they open with, Daniel? Do you know?
I do not. I know it's 4 games that they should win. I'll pull it up while you
right.
While you
so, yeah, the reality for Michigan was, well, you put yourself in a situation that wasn't going to be very hard to deal with. And yeah, I got it right in front of me. So it's Eastern Carolina, UNLV, Bowling Green, and Rutgers. I was right. Yeah. So there's 130 teams for me to follow, and somehow, occasionally I get things wrong, but I think I get things right more often than not. That's not much of a suspension. The 3 non-P5 teams and Rutgers, they knew what they were doing when they agreed to that, and it's about optics with the NCAA. It genuinely won't shock me if the Committee on Infractions looked at the settlement and looked at the schedule and went, wait a minute, this ain't a real suspension. And the trick is he'd be out of coaching, and I don't know what the suspension means, if it just means he can't be on the sidelines during game days or he can't coach weekly. But my guess is that this probably did factor into it, that the suspension was a little bit meaningless at the beginning of the season with the 4 teams it was going to be against. And then it's Nebraska, Minnesota, Indiana, Michigan State. It's a backloaded schedule to start with.
Josh, there's a joke here about them
the
going back to the table and just saying, okay, we'll take till November 11th. You got us. They don't play a team until November 11th.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not even sure what their hardest game is. Minnesota? Probably.
Because Maryland's in there. Maryland's a tough game, but it's not until the 18th. This is what gets me a little frustrated when Michigan fans, get sensitive about their schedule, and Georgia fans too. We say this 1,000 times. You can't help that Nebraska's not any good or Michigan State's probably not going to be any good. You can't help that, but don't try to make it out like you've got some schedule like that. Those are 2 totally different things.
Yeah, it is a 3-game schedule. If you want to be a national champion, it's a 3-game schedule, and the rest of it you got to survive. And I know it's a grind in the Big Ten. Look, that's true of every conference. If you're a team that's going to win a national title, you really shouldn't lose a game before November 11th, assuming a team isn't a lot better than anticipated. But, those last 3 games are quite hard, and going 3-0 in those games will be quite hard. And if you go 3-0, you deserve to be in the top 4 of the country. It's that simple. So it's a little bit SEC-like in a lot of ways. And Daniel, I don't know if you agree with me, but Big Ten fans often like to complain about these SEC schedules because, oh man, look at how weak their out-of-conference opponents are. Well, East Carolina, UNLV, and Bowling Green is a pretty easy out-of-conference schedule. But when you're trying to win a national title, it's all about your 4 hardest games, almost always. That's the thing that sets the difficulty. Every metric, when they try to calculate the odds of having a loss, it always comes down to your 4 hardest schedules. I think, what was the stat? I don't remember it off the top of my head, but I think in the something called ELS in Brian Fremeau's FEI calculates the odds of an elite team losing games, and it's 8 of the top 10 were SEC teams. And it's because the 3 or 4 hardest games they play are so hard. Even though they play an FCS, even though they only play an 8-game conference schedule, it's all about your 3 or 4 hardest games if you're an elite team, because the odds of losing to a team outside the top 65 are virtually non-existent. And Michigan has a hard schedule to win a national title. They have a very easy schedule to make a bowl, but they have a hard schedule to win a national title. It's a little bit of a different world to be playing in. And I think there are a lot of Michigan fans that like to crow about SEC schedules that probably should shut up a little bit and realize you're going to take a dose of that medicine this year and deal with that reality. Now, they'll say they don't play an FCS in November 18th, and That's a whole other discussion, but I guarantee you a lot of SEC schools have a 3-game stretch that's this difficult or similarly difficult. And, if you navigate it, you deserve to be in the playoff.
I can't imagine an SEC team other than Georgia not gladly trading that FCS game for this schedule. I mean, look, if you're Vanderbilt, the difference between East Carolina and an FCS matters. If you are a playoff team, you're going to beat either one of those 50-6, and you're going to rest your starters at halftime. Josh, anything else on Michigan, or have we successfully alienated everyone in the state of Michigan for the season?
The only thing I'll add is that you've repeatedly said you think they deserve to be a top 3 team
Yeah,
this year.
I do.
It's a joke that they're not. We're very high on Michigan. Let me be clear on that. And I'm just saying the schedule actually, it's very easy from a bowl perspective, but again, hard from a playoff perspective. This is a good team capable of making the playoffs. I think probably well positioned to do so. But the situation with Harbaugh is what it is.
All right, Josh, it is preview time for us in this portion of the show. Let's start off with a team that we talk about a lot, and we manage to make people mad when we praise them and mad when we don't, because it's either Texas A&M fans mad at us or everybody else. Let's talk Texas A&M. I have some questions, Josh, mostly around how much Petrino is going to have the reins for this offense this year. Because I think if he has the reins and Jimbo completely steps back, there's an opportunity here for this Texas A&M team to be hugely improved. People don't realize how good that defense was last year, especially pass defense. I think Texas A&M can be a very good, legit team this year, but I'm worried that it might not show in the win-loss column. Like, obviously they'll show improved, but they might be an 11-win team in normal years staring at a 9-3, 8-4 because their schedule is just that hard, and I think people don't appreciate that.
Yeah, there's a lot of good and bad when you look at last year. A lot of bad and then some weirdly good. Like you said, beating LSU 38-23 wasn't even that close of a game. I think in many ways was one of the most under-the-radar upsets of 2022. LSU is being considered by a lot of people as a top 3 team. We've given our thoughts on that enough that we don't agree with that perspective. But a part of that was the fact that Texas A&M did beat them and beat them soundly. Now, that pointed to sort of the realities for Texas A&M as a football team last year, in particular that this was a team that was very incomplete on both sides of the ball. One of the best pass defenses in the country, and I'll go ahead and pull it up while I'm talking. From a pass defense perspective, Texas A&M was phenomenal. And teams that were really reliant on throwing the football or reliant on doing things that were susceptible to disruption had a lot of trouble with Texas A&M. They averaged 156.2 yards per game through the air. That was number 1 in the country. They allowed 5.7 yards per attempt. That was number 4 in the country. And then the problem was that in games where teams could really run the ball successfully and relied on physicality and a great offensive line, they struggled. So if you look at rushing defense, I'm not seeing them here in the top 5. I'm not seeing them in the top 10, top 30, top 50, top 60. That's because they were 123rd. 123rd in the country. They gave up 209 yards per game. That's a bit deceptive. They're bad. They weren't quite that bad. I think 109th from yards per carry, which is, again, still quite bad, but not 123rd bad. The trick was, I think, that they were so young and they were so dependent on a lot of these signees from that number 1 recruiting class that from a athleticism perspective defensively, they played very well. The secondary was good. From a physicality gap assignment perspective, they were horrid. And so you saw throughout all the way through the season, and when they played teams that were well designed to run the ball between the tackles and play with power, they often just got rolled over. The Appalachian State game was a great example. They only gave up 17 points, but the key was Appalachian State ran a lot of option concepts, and they went 4 down, and Texas A&M could not get them off the field. That was a very short game. There were not many drives played because they were so able to convert without throwing the football. They couldn't get explosive plays, but App State could continue to maintain possessions. You look at some of their other losses that were a little more jarring. 41-24 to Florida. Florida could run the ball pretty well. And Anthony Richardson's a physical guy. That was a football team that was well equipped to play Texas A&M because they couldn't really throw the ball and didn't have to. Mississippi State ran all over Texas A&M. Even with the air raid spread, that was a game where they dominated with the run. But some of the other games, Alabama in particular with a backup quarterback, still running that Bryce Young offense. Their offensive line wasn't fantastic last year, and A&M was able to get a lot of disruption. They caused multiple fumbles. That's why that game was so close. LSU's offensive line was not great last year. Jaden Daniels was under pressure for most of the year. They played better late in the year because the offensive line started playing a little bit better and they had some time in the pocket. Early in the year, he really didn't have any. They played Jaden Daniels as the starter, I think, really because they knew the offensive line wasn't great and they needed that mobility. But LSU was a bad matchup against A&M because they couldn't run the ball, which means they couldn't run it that well or well enough to sustain a game. So they had to throw, and that played into A&M's hands. And conversely, Texas A&M couldn't really throw the ball themselves, but they did have a pretty good run game. And against teams that had struggles stopping the run, that they had a lot of success. So, sort of walking through it, what's really obvious was how boom or bust A&M was, how much of a matchup dependent team they were in 2022. And I think you're a little more optimistic on them, and I have to think it's because you think they're going to be a more balanced football team, right?
Well, I think that there's a couple of things. One, I feel like run defense is something that can probably be shored up in the offseason a little better than pass defense, unless you are just completely depleted at defensive line. But for me, I just can't get past losses in games like App State, almost like Miami, where the offense was just so comically inept that it didn't matter how good their defense was. And so from that standpoint, you don't know what the defense is doing to maybe try to force turnovers or try to force short fields, be overly aggressive because they know their offense is going to go 3 and out 6 times a game. I think that just really played into a lot of it. And I almost don't even care about offensive personnel because if Petrino's running the show, look, if Jimbo Fisher doesn't let Petrino run the show, it's going to be more of the same. And I think that Jimbo Fisher's ego year was last year because he had questions going into last year of whether or not he was going to let someone else sort of have some influence in the offense, and he kept it for himself, and it was a disaster. I think he kind of sees that now, right? He's locked in the contract. They're not going to fire him. It's more about legacy and getting actual wins. And I think from that standpoint, Petrino's going to be the guy. So again, I don't care about the offensive personnel. Like we can talk about who they lost. We can talk about struggles at quarterback last year, and we're going to see a lot of the same quarterback this year. Although probably not. We're not going to see King, but still, offense will be tremendously improved. But you did make a good point because even that A&M Alabama game. Alabama couldn't throw the ball, but they ran for basically 300 yards. Florida, Richardson, no surprise, didn't throw it great, but they ran for 300 yards. I'm curious, though, Josh, looking at this schedule, one of the games that Texas A&M fans might be counting in the bag that might end up being tougher than they expect is that game at Miami in week 2. You're high on Miami. Maybe talk about that a little bit before we break down the rest of the schedule.
Yeah, and when I say high, I mean higher than I think most people are. Miami last year was a team that really suffered due to a lack of offensive identity, and at some point that begins to sort of crater the whole program. Again, A&M saw that last year. We've been long-term critics of Josh Gaddis, and you can track what happened with Michigan with him when he left and they brought in a new offensive coordinator. Suddenly, Michigan was a much more competent offensive football team. I think you're going to see the same thing in Miami. I mean, he clearly ruined Tyler Van Dyke, who was one of the most highly touted guys, dark horse Heisman candidate, and ended up losing the starting job at a point last year. I think it was just a total lack of offensive game planning and cohesion. That's going to be a more competent football team, and it's going to be a much more dangerous one as a result. And I do agree with you. I'll even take it a step further and say week 2, week 4, week 5, Miami, Auburn, and versus Arkansas is not an easy start. Auburn is going to be a more competent football team than they've been the last couple of years. I don't think the personnel is very good. but they're going to be a more competent team schematically. Arkansas still gets back KJ Jefferson, and that is a good football team, or at least a dangerous one. You're going to know who A&M is before they get to that Alabama game. And they're either going to be solidly cemented as a mid-tier or lower SEC team, or they're going to be in a position to clamor for a higher position. But they've got to be good out of the gate. And this is not an easy schedule by any means. At Miami, Auburn, Arkansas, a neutral site, Alabama. Then they play at Tennessee the week after Alabama. Play at Ole Miss, Mississippi State, and they end at LSU. We had our discussion about Michigan, right? Talking about it's a 3-game schedule. They don't play Georgia here, right? I'm not sure that there's a stretch that's as rough as what they're playing Penn State, Maryland, and Ohio State back to back. But in terms of consistency of scheduling, in terms of, again, Michigan saying that's a very easy schedule to make a bowl, this is a brutal schedule to make a bowl. You could be the 60th best team in the country, and you very easily could go 5-7 with this schedule. In fact, probably would. This, in my view of this team, is I think this team could be a lot better. Again, all the receivers are coming back, and this is a receiving core that finally found out what they were supposed to be doing about halfway through the year. I think the quarterback position, they'll find somebody more competent than they were early to mid last year. The defense should be pretty good. All those young front seven players are going to be better, and they're going to be older, stronger, more physical. And I don't know that it's going to show up in the record because the schedule is just so brutally hard.
Yeah, and I think that there's stretches in the schedule where you have to have leaps and bounds improvements offensively, because that's how you beat teams that could beat you and beat them pretty soundly, namely teams like Arkansas and Auburn. Especially Arkansas, that's a team that has turnover every year and it's hard for them to reload, especially on the defensive side of the ball. Arkansas, for whatever reason, just has had trouble fielding a really good defense. But their offense is going to score points. KJ Jefferson's great. Sanders is great. They have the capability of scoring points on anybody. So you need to be able to come in out the gate, put touchdowns on the board, change their scheme offensively, put them into uncomfortable positions because they know they're going to have to score 40 points to win the game. Same thing with Auburn. Auburn is a team that, last year beat A&M, but they beat them 13-10, right? Like this is a game where, similar to Texas A&M, this bad offense might actually be really good just because who's calling the shots. So you need to be able to take advantage of all the other weaknesses on the Auburn team and come in and score a bunch of points. Same thing with Tennessee. Same thing with South Carolina, Ole Miss. These are teams that aren't going to be great defensively, but can beat you on a day where they can catch fire and score 35 points, and you need to be able to really just stamp that out early on. So, Josh, I don't want to really predict a record here because it's going to be tough, but I want to really, I think I said 10 games. They might win 10 games this year in our first show this summer. Looking at the schedule, I think that's tough, but man, if they can survive, if they can make it to Alabama undefeated, then they've got some breathing room. What's the possibility you think of them just getting to October 7th with a clean record?
The odds of any team running any kind of gauntlet are always a lot lower than you think. I mean, even if a team has an 80% chance to win 3 games, then the total sum of your odds to win all 3 of them is still going to be less than 50%. So I would say A&M's chance to make it undefeated to Alabama, in theory, is probably like 1 in 3. But that's not really fair, right? Because when you say odds, this isn't a coin that you're flipping in the air. It's a real football team, and we're talking about real variables and real change. So whether they make it to Alabama is really dependent on who the football team is and the decisions that are made and the culture of the program. This was a team that was known to have major culture problems last year. It's well known. It's a team that has Bobby Petrino and DJ Durkin and Jimbo Fisher all on the same roster. So how that team gels and how successful they are is going to be a huge factor in everything. And if Petrino takes over, and I do think he's a very bright offensive mind and is able to play within, coach within his role, I think they can make it to undefeated. If those pieces don't work out, they're probably not. And so it's not really about the games themselves or the teams. So much about Texas A&M depends upon who Texas A&M is. And I think within this sort of bracket of teams, they're probably the hardest one to predict because there's so much potential for them to be better and so much potential for them to spiral. With these head coaches being who they are, it reminds me a lot of when Orgeron went and hired the guy from Nebraska, Bo Pelini, and that personality fit just didn't work at all. And when they started to struggle, then there was a lot of blame that went around and things collapsed. And I really feel it's going to be a similar situation here. If these coaches are able to turn things around and they're able to get momentum, I think they can have a lot of success. I think the culture naturally improves on teams that are winning. If they start to struggle, if they drop one or two of those early games, this team is probably going to go south in a hurry. And so, in a weird way, I almost think it's as likely for Texas A&M to win all 5 of the games prior to Alabama as it is for them to go 2-3 up to that point. And quite honestly, I don't know how to even guess at where they're going to be, because so much of it is dependent upon the cultural and coaching shifts that need to happen in the offseason. And to this point, I haven't been able to see it well enough to be able to handicap it.
A&M's rolling in to Tuscaloosa undefeated. I'm calling it right now. I think that I think culturally they're going to see a boost from 2 things. One, not having a guy calling the offense that's been year over year inept. Having a guy in here that's a guy coming in Petrino that's got some gravitas as an offensive mind, and he's going to prove it on the field early on. They're going to have good culture too, because I feel like they've removed some pieces and some mindset from guys who, A&M fans can be mad, came there because they secured a bag. I just, this can make A&M fans upset, but it's true. You had guys on that team that were there to get paid, and once they started losing, that created a toxic culture inside that locker room. And I think now, I think there are guys still there that were there for the money, but the mentality will have been purged after a year. And to your point, if they do start losing, I could see it steamrolling. But right now, I think that stretch will catch up to them, but not until maybe Alabama at Tennessee, then South Carolina. That's a tough stretch, and then Ole Miss. And they have Alabama at home. They're not rolling in Tuscaloosa. Alabama's coming to them, but I think that they're going to be 5-0 headed into that game. Josh, any more thoughts on A&M before we move it on?
Well, the one thought I'll have is, if you're an A&M fan, however the season goes or doesn't go, the future's still pretty bright. The talent on this roster is really good. The defensive talent in particular is really, really good. And if this ends up being 2012 Auburn, who just imploded a couple of years off and being a national title caliber team, the odds of them turning next year into 2013 Auburn that makes it to the national title game, I think, are pretty good. This roster is well positioned in a year or two when it gets older to be a top tier roster in the SEC, but it is still transitioning from a developmental standpoint, and it's massively in flux due to a cultural and head coaching standpoint. But even if the season goes south, these players don't become less talented as a result of that. And if you're able to hang on to them and you're able to get new coaches or whatever it may be, it really is just a matter of time until this pays off and this ends up being the sort of Texas A&M football team that we've seen off and on the last decade. So I would say the future is pretty bright. I'm just not so sold that it's going to happen this year.
Fair enough. Maybe that's enough to get A&M fans back, get you back in their good graces. We'll see. We'll see how it goes. But I'm on record, y'all. 5-0. If I'm wrong, then that'll be the first time that's ever happened. All right, Josh.
It's the internet. Nobody remembers anything. Don't worry about it. There's no record.
Everybody remembers when we miss stuff, but when they miss it, arguing with us, we don't hear from 6 months, and they come back the next year to give us a hard time. All right, Josh. Florida State is an interesting one to talk about. There's a lot of heat around this Florida State team. And they had a nice round 10-win season, 10-3. Although Athlon magazine has given them credit for a win against NC State that they didn't have, which would have made them 11-2. I think there's a lot to like here. I think that they're finally getting comfortable with good coaching in Norvell and shaking off the years of just not having quality quality coaching. They've got some talent there. People don't realize how good Jordan Travis was last year and really how good this offense was last year. Josh, Jordan Travis was tied for 5th overall at 9.1 yards per attempt last year, but there were only two Power 5 quarterbacks who threw for more yards per attempt than Jordan Travis. That's C.J. Stroud and Hendon Hooker in 2022. And those were 9.5, so not even that much further off from him. 24 touchdowns on 5 interceptions, super high rating. There's two things that concern me this year, Josh. You can talk about either one or both. One is for all of the fair hype that Travis and Florida State's getting, I don't think people realize how much this defense let them down last year. And I don't think people realize that this is a sneaky hard schedule this year.
Yeah, I mean, I think the issue with Florida State has been inconsistency. So I'm going to answer one of those questions and then add an answer you didn't ask for, and then I'll flip the schedule back to you. But in terms of defensive performance and in terms of just consistency of performance in general, the problem with Travis is that he was a 9.1 yard per attempt guy, but it was very up and down. He had 3 games below 7 yards per attempt. North Carolina State in that loss, he threw for 6 yards per attempt, 1 touchdown, 2 interceptions. He was only 50% passing for 180 yards. Against Clemson in that loss, 6 yards per attempt, 2 touchdowns, 254. 24-42, he had to throw a lot, kind of out of necessity, but still not a great average. And then Syracuse, weirdly, it was 38-3 game, and he went 21-23, but he only threw for 6.7 yards per attempt and 155 yards passing. There were just games where they didn't get much. Even like the Louisville game, which was a close win, only threw for 157 yards, and it was a 9.2 yard per attempt average, but not great. The problem, I mean, you can really see it across the board, right? Florida was 9 yards per attempt, but 13 of 30 passing. That's a 43% passing game. You can't have that kind of inconsistency, right? You can't have games where, some games even if you have a good average, per play, if you're 13 of 30, those incompletions turn into punts, right? If I'm hitting an 80-yard touchdown pass, but I only hit it every 5 plays, I have 16 yards per attempt, and I probably have at least 1 punt for every touchdown because those 4 incompletions are going to lead to 1 or 2 punts, 1 or 2 3 and outs before you get to that touchdown drive. And what ends up happening is, your yard per attempt average is really high, but the number of possessions you have starts getting really rough, right? You get 3 and outs, you're scoring, but you're scoring slowly, you're getting dominated on time of possession. And that's kind of some of the insidious things that go on behind the scenes, I think, with Travis. And to spin it around a little bit, you see a lot of that same problems exist defensively. Now, statistically, they were a top 25 unit. I think they were 24th in yard per play defense. But when you break down the performances, again, the consistency just wasn't good enough. In the final against Oklahoma, gave up 496 yards. The game against Florida, who was not a great offense, gave up 460 and 6.3 yards per play. Louisville, they gave up 495. And then there are other games like Miami and Syracuse where they're giving up 188, 160 yards, 164 to Duquesne. And so their statistics on average look, again, solidly good. Right at top 25 level, 4.85 yards per play. But it's kind of a weird mix of games where they're giving up over 5 yards per play, over 6 yards per play in a lot of instances, and other games where they didn't give up much at all. And so, even like 370 against Clemson is not great. 5.5 yards per play. That wasn't a good offense last year overall. Wake Forest, 405 yards. I mean, I could go down the list. And so that's the deal with Florida State. It's not just about getting better. It's about avoiding those games where either the offense or the defense doesn't play up to their potential. Because if you want to step up from being a 10-3 team, or if you're Athlon 11-2, and you want to move to being a 1-loss team, that requires consistency. College football is unlike the NFL, and this is something a lot of people struggle with understanding. The NFL is all about being the best team you can be on average, because every game is pretty similar. Dropping 3 or 4 games is not a big deal in the grand scheme of things. In college football, avoiding losses is the name of the game if you want to be at the playoff level. It's about not having real dud games. It's about not losing to teams you shouldn't lose to. And Florida State stepped forward in that regard has to come from a consistency basis, both from Travis and from the defense. And that's important, segue, because the schedule can be a little bit challenging.
All of the fans watching this back home that are pulling for the Duquesne Dukes are going to get at you in the comments for mispronouncing.
Well, the six of them can get at me. That's fine.
I think that there's a little bit of a veneer on the season last year that people don't realize that is really present in what you were just saying. And I'm I'm going to spin this positive in a second, but I want to touch on this. I want to live here for just a little bit. That Clemson game, 34-28, but it was 34-14 until like mid fourth quarter, and they tacked on a couple of touchdowns late. They had no business letting Florida play within a touchdown of them. I think the LSU win was good, but there's other games like losing to NC State, scoring 21 on Wake Forest. I'm not mad about giving up 31 to Wake because Hartman can get hot. They can put up a 45 spot on somebody, but like giving up.
And they ran 85 plays in that game. We talk about that a lot in college, right? The Clemson game was a 67 play game, and the Wake Forest game is an 85 play game. You know, points don't always mean the same things because some of these teams play at such tempo that, yeah, you're going to give up more points just because they effectively make the game a lot longer.
But you can't let DJU dunk on you for 8.8 and 3 tutties. Like, you just can't. And that's the thing that I think they probably learned. I'll dig a little more into the schedule, but Josh, do you think this is kind of a fair thing to say? You need a year like Florida State had last year before you could ever have an elite year. You don't go from like 6-6 usually, from like 6-6 to national championship contender until you have one of those good years where you just grind through a couple of pretty bad performances and kind of learn who you are. Feels like 2008 Alabama a little bit.
Yeah, and it doesn't always have to come the year prior, but the roster has to know what it looks like, I think. 2018, LSU wasn't particularly good, and offensively they were pretty inconsistent. Auburn was infamously terrible in 2012 before the 2013 run, but it's easy to forget 2016 LSU was quite good. Auburn had just won the national title in 2010, and they were a good football team in 2011. You have to have some knowledge of what it looks like to be a good football team, and to know. I think sometimes you have to know the little things that can cost you a title, right? The roster has to be aware of the inconsistencies that cause you to lose games that you shouldn't lose, and that pushes you to be better. And I don't know how many times you see, like you said, the most common thing for a national champion is a team that lost a couple games the year prior and had games where they weren't consistent enough or weren't well-rounded enough. But the problem, I think, in trying to evaluate all this, and this is not neither positive nor negative, let me be clear, this is also a roster with a ton of transfers, is the new world of it. Defensively, they should be better as a result of transfers, in theory. Offensively, they also take in transfers at key units. The offensive line was a disaster that Jimbo Fisher left them, and if you're an FSU fan, you're probably cursing his name right now because he did leave a smoking crater. And they've used the transfer portal to shore those things up. But the problem with transfers is there's no continuity with these issues, right? Knowing what happened last year and how you improved and what went wrong, and then just from a developmental standpoint, right, you weren't playing together. And that makes it, I think, a little different and tougher in this era. And I just say this from a perspective of I'm not really sure how to take it, right? Does that sort of negate the need for it because these are guys that struggled at other programs and learned lessons, they want to fix it here? Or does it mean that the culture that should see an overall shift from one year to another where you step up to another level has a harder time taking that step forward because so many pieces weren't there the year prior? I don't know. I don't know how to evaluate it, but it's definitely an interesting observation. Again, for a team that has a schedule that is capable of winning a title, I think, but also pretty challenging. Kind of a nice, I think, medium ground where you're going to get credit for who you play, but maybe not so utterly brutal that it makes it almost impossible.
It's interesting they play one another, but I like, you talk about transfers. LSU took a lot of transfers too, and I feel like there's schools and coaches whose identity is not conducive to really folding transfers into the culture quickly and getting them to assimilate in a way that makes them super successful, Ole Miss comes to mind. Like, I don't feel like Lane Kiffin, like, he relies a lot on transfers, but I don't think he is a presence that drives culture in a way that gets buy-in super fast, and a team that self-polices and makes people fall in line. Kelly seems like a guy that can do it, but Norvell also seems like a guy that can do it. So it remains to be seen, like you said, but I think it could be a positive. It just depends on, one, whether or not they fold in and really sort of become part of the team in all aspects, and also whether or not they're actually good. The schedule is concerning for me, and we got a lot of SEC listeners. They're going to look at the schedule and kind of scoff at it, but Duke is not a bad football team. Good quarterback, going to be better this year. Clemson is going to be much improved offensively, and this is a team that scored 34 last year on Florida State. Clemson might be, it depends on personnel-wise what they do, but they might be playoff caliber team this year. But Florida State might also be, which means that game is going to be absolutely a monster. Florida loses a first-round quarterback, but probably is going to be a better team overall, including offensively. Neither you nor myself were high on Richardson, and cannot for the life of either of us understand why he got drafted where he did. Miami's going to be a better football team, especially offensively. We just got finished talking about that in the Texas A&M preview. That's a tougher game. None of these teams are elite, except for maybe Clemson, but they're all good enough to beat you on any given day. And then so when you put them all together and you have to play them in a row, or you have to multiple road games in a row, it makes it really tough. But Josh, I wonder, are we going to overreact with the LSU Florida State game on both sides? Whoever wins, whoever loses, is that game so big and just so, like, it was a wonderful event last year. It kind of set the season off. Is that game so big that we run the risk of putting too much weight into the win and the loss in that one?
I mean, almost certainly. The reality is someone's going to come out of the game with a loss, and somebody's going to come out of the game undefeated, right? I mean, that's
riveting.
That's what has to happen.
Really got us on the on the analysis.
Yeah, I know. I mean, this is what they pay me for, right? There is somebody paying me, isn't there? No. I mean, it's stupid, but this obvious point gets missed a lot, right? That people are going to come out of the first 3 weeks 3-0, and some people are going to come out 0-3. It's the necessity. Somebody wins and loses every game. So who LSU and FSU are is not going to be determined by whether it was a close game. It's not going to be determined by who won the game. I think if FSU wins, they're going to get a lot of credit, but the tendency is going to be to say, oh, LSU wasn't as good. Like, people are always more willing in some ways to hype the high-ranked team that wins than the low-ranked team that upsets the high-ranked team, I think. And it doesn't really matter. I mean, these can both be elite playoff caliber teams and have a close game or what looks to be an ugly game because the defenses are good. And these can be really bad teams, and they could have an all-timer because they have a lot of areas where they struggle, and they causes it to be a wild, fun game. I think, frankly, in the opener last year, that was not good football. And I say that saying that I thought both these teams ended being really good teams. But LSU and FSU were not good football teams week one last year. They just weren't. And it's why that game was so fun and wild, and FSU won at the last moment. It was one of the more fun games of the whole year. But it was kind of fun because it was bad football in a lot of ways. And FSU got a lot better over the course of the year, which I don't think a lot of people appreciate to the extent they should. But it's going to be the same deal. I mean, people are going to overreact to it, and people are going to react differently because of the preseason rankings. Look, those preseason rankings don't matter one iota, really. They really don't. And I know people talk about you are where you are in the polls and you don't move. But, yeah, you do move when you win or lose football games. And that's all that's going to matter because these schedules are hard enough that if they are playoff caliber teams, they're going to have to prove it in wins against good football teams themselves. So I think it is going to be an overreaction. Our reaction to the football teams are going to be based on how good they are. No one looks that great in college football early in the season. We forget this every year because we remember bowl season last year. Forget how much teams always kind of start over and have to rebuild every season. And so, yeah, it'll be an overreaction. It's been hyped to be an overreaction, both being top 10 teams. They're going to continue to hype them. But, it's just one game. It's an out-of-conference game. Either one of these teams can lose this game, go undefeated, and probably will make the playoffs. So it doesn't really matter that much. I'm just excited to see a big-time football game. And, and again, even just gauging who these two teams are, I don't feel like I'm going to really know until week 4 or 5. With FSU, until they play Clemson, I'm not going to really draw any strong conclusions. And I'm saying that right now, whether you win or lose. If you lose, I'm not going to hold it against you because LSU may be great. If you win, I'm not going to go too overboard because LSU, still have questions about. You've got to wait and see a little bit, and I think that's fair. And if you want to be critical of it, be critical of it, but realize you're going to prove it one way or another. It's just a matter of waiting out the 3 or 4 weeks to see how good they really are, having played a number of different teams.
For me, there's two things about this game that I love. One, LSU, Florida State playing one another. And like you said, they can play, and it doesn't have a lot of stakes in terms of the end of the year, but they're still playing. They're not, skirting this responsibility of playing out of conference games that matter. Clemson and Florida State are really good about this. Those are two teams, by the way. Florida State doesn't get enough credit. We give credit to Clemson for this and Georgia for this, but Florida State plays Florida at the end of the year. They have an SEC brand name Power 5 on their schedule, and they're also going to open the season with LSU. In an era of Power 5 teams avoiding any out-of-conference Power 5s, like to bake in home games and wins. This is a series they signed up for. They play them 2 years in a row, but both were neutral site games, so nobody got home game credit. I love this. This is awesome. Some of this is probably going to go away with super conferences, but this is completely undersung this year and last year that a Florida State team could have gone and scheduled some G5 that they just bake in a win because they got Florida at the end of the year, and nobody's going to say anything about it. They went out of their way to make it tougher because at some level within their administration, they believe in good competitive football like Georgia does when they don't have to, like Clemson does when they don't have to. So for that, they get a ton of credit from me. Josh, anything else on Florida State before we wrap it up?
Well, the only thing I'll note is we really didn't spend that much time talking about the roster. And it's not that we don't note it or find it interesting. It's just, you only have so much time in a video, but I do want to touch on it, right? I mean, this is a team that's bringing in all conference level transfers on top of having all conference level players, right? Cypress at corner is a big addition. I think late in the season, they really figured things out in the passing game. That was a big boon. The wide receiving core, it was clear they didn't really know how to use them early in the year, and later on they figured out where their strengths and weaknesses were. They found a good running back in Benson. Supposedly he's bulked up a lot. There's a lot of stuff to be excited about. But I will say, as an outside party, not being able to go to fall camp and see these guys in person, it's hard for me to say a lot more than that until I see them in person. It's so hard to judge transfers because they play at one level of competition against one group of teams. Now they got to play at a different level in a different system around other players. This is a hard team to pick apart on a roster level with all the pieces, front line players in both teams or both sides of the ball playing differently. But there are enough solid pieces that you think it's a good core, and then whether or not those transfers gel is probably going to be the difference between whether they're an elite unit or whether they're kind of a unit like they were last year, where they were pretty good in a lot of ways, but they weren't necessarily consistent, or they weren't complete enough to be consistent in others. I just don't know, and there's no way for me to tell until I see them on a football field.
Honestly, it's probably going to come down to depth and not that starting line talent for Florida State, because now their expectations after having a 10-win season and getting a taste of what can be a really good momentum building year into what's higher expectations, I think is really going to come down to depth. And that's where you need those transfers to not just be bodies. Like, they need to contribute. So, all right, well, that's it for us this week. I hope you like the long format shows, or if you're watching this cut up, we do a long format show every week that's basically, just talking ball. Some of it has previews or team previews, and the season will be game previews, but some of it's just our opinions on some stuff. Thanks for sticking with us this long. Y'all have a great week. God bless.